Hello. How we all doing?
All right. So thanks, everybody. We've that's better. We've got a presentation and hopefully some questions on a topic that's probably certainly we've put it up as a provocation. It's a little black and white, but then again, this is a sector that's relatively evidence poor and yet opinion rich, and so we'll be providing our opinions into this space. And of course, it's most of you will have seen Lisa's presentation this morning, informed by this language comes from the United Nations Special Rapporteur and a series of reports 2017 through to 2020, identifying and building on the work, as Lisa said, of Brian Burdekin and highlighting the human rights breaches that our mental health system imposes upon people, and talking about the need for a paradigm shift. And this is the paradigm shift that has been named, as we all know, since at least 1993 in Australia with the Burdekin report. All right, so before we begin properly, just to do our acknowledgement and to acknowledge that as part of our positionality in recognising that we're on the unceded country here of the Turrbal people, and pay our respects to elders across the country, that we are speaking from a very white, middle-class, privileged position in inhabiting a lived experience perspective, and that First Nations people have a very different conceptualisation of lived experience, particularly rooted in the violence of and ongoing violence of colonisation, and of course understandings of social and emotional well-being. So we'll try and stay in our lane as much as possible around that. Okay, so I guess one of the reasons we thought talking about narrative control as a conceptualisation to unpack a little bit is we often focus on the services that people receive in these conversations about human rights breaches. But I think sometimes we forget that that didn't come down from Moses on the mountain, these services. They're derived from a particular way of thinking about distress. And so our context for this conversation is around, obviously, the CRPD, which has really activated a lot of these conversations. And it's not in a vacuum. We know in Australia, and we'll talk about this a bit, and Lisa spoke to it very much in her presentation, that we have a spectacular history in Australia of attempting reform and failing miserably at implementing it. And one of the reasons is because of this big stuck, as it's called in the literature. We are stuck in how we think about distress, and there is a narrative control in the data that we use, in the reporting on that data that we use. It shapes the research, it shapes the services, it shapes the policies, our policy tools. We're leaning very much into, in the context of this failure to reform, some system change literature, because after all, we've been talking about it at least since 1993. You think we might be, if we're truly interested in enacting those normative, transformational concepts, we would lean into and understand and invest a little bit in change management, because that's what we're talking about, change management. And we know that that's a difficult topic, but there is a significant field that stretches beyond mental health around systems change literature, so we'll have a bit of a look at that. And then we're going to use some examples of this violence, effectively, that or epistemic violence around who controls the narrative. Okay, so we just wanted to surface as part of a conversation around narrative that comes with power, that comes with agendas, and we thought it was important for us to name our positionality in talking into these spaces. So I'm obviously a person who's had a lived experience as a family member of somebody experiencing enduring unsupported psychosis. It's deeply impactful on our family. And as a consequence of the harms done to our family, I'm very, very transparent that my positionality is that the current narrative, the current policies, the current services in this space are not only ineffective, but they are intentionally designed to be harmful at the end of the day. So I come with that perspective and a very, very different internal narrative around the validity and legitimacy of the key concepts that underpin current Australian mental health systems. I also have a positionality not only as a family member and as a person who is critical of the harmful system that we exist in, but I'm also extremely privileged. And so our experiences, as harmful as they were, are nowhere near as bad and as harmful and as outrageous as people who are even less privileged than us in our situation. And Amanda, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Kerry. I guess my position, as I've shared already earlier today, I come from that first person, direct contact with services through the impacts, I guess, of trauma, from childhood trauma. And I guess that is the place where I come from, and how I've got to know what I know is, and how that's changed over the period of time throughout my life has been from my time in services and my time outside of services, yeah, just really am a champion for reform because of those experiences that weren't particularly helpful for myself and my family.
And I think we should have also just said both Amanda and I have worked together for probably nearly 15 years now. And so I think we have a very, very shared understanding that we would probably call the big L, big E understandings of distress, and very much born from a system that has harmed. But I think both of us at the time in services didn't understand, but very quickly understood that we weren't alone in these situations, and that we know actually around the world there's about 20 million people, I think, impacted by psychosis, and the outcomes are unbelievably appalling. And to Lisa's point earlier, how is it that we have lived within Australia for over 30 years now these outrageous human rights atrocities? What's holding this system in place? And that's really where we've both arrived at as a consequence of our own individual experiences. Okay, so the context for the title for our conversation that we'll be having today is just a little bit broader. So this is really an expansion of the lived experience. Grey literature and conversations for so long was always, don't ask what's wrong with me, ask what's happened to me. And really that was said out loud by Danius Puris and picked up very much a lived experience perspective of understandings of distress, and really went out quite hard during his terms to talk about the crisis just not being really around what's going on between people's ears, but what's going on in society for people, and asking for a reframing and a paradigm shift, both in terms of experiences within services, but actually also experiences that create distress and the systems that are holding Australian mental health services from shifting. We've both of us come from Wajak Noongar Budjar at some point in time with our work, and looked at a very expensive 10-year plan that was going to reform the system, and we just watched that fade away. Most of you will have been aware of the Royal Commission failure in Victoria. States and territories around the country have tried to address these reforms and have failed, and so we're very, very interested in what creates that stuckness. Okay, so Danius Puris had some thoughts about this, and it deliberately used the provocation language again. So how is it that we address this grossly unmet need? And Australian policy is very much around unmet need at the moment. We talk about that a lot. He's inserted the word rights-based in there as well. So very much flipping it around, rights-based, and that actually, instead of a global burden of disease, which is the general health-based language that's used, he's talking about we need to do an assessment on the global burden of obstacles, so the human rights issues that Lisa talked about, the social determinants, and that has maintained, there's an invisible hand somewhere that is maintaining the status quo. We can't say we don't know, and we have known since at least the Burdekin report. So what is it about this unpacking of the biomedical paradigm, the power asymmetries, the biased use of evidence? He called it out very, very clearly, saying effectively and giving authorisation to the things that people with lived experience had been saying for decades.
Many, many years.
Okay, so obviously we've got the international context pushing reform along. The reason we're unpacking these paradigms a little bit today, as Lisa so beautifully articulated this morning, we do have this grand tradition of failed reform. So not only the Burdekin report in 1993, we had a few national mental health plans. The most recent fifth one, interestingly, there were two pieces in Lisa's presentation, just to draw back to this morning, that were actually part of the fifth plan. So we did have a fifth plan that was overtaken by the Productivity Commission inquiry and now the agreement. But in the fifth plan, there were a couple of pieces that were left undone, one of which was the quality rights training that Lisa talked about this morning. That was an action item out of the fifth plan, never implemented, but marked as complete by the National Mental Health Commission. So not implemented because my favourite, Western Australia, because training people in rights, in human rights, in quality rights, would have contravened the Western Australian legislation. So therefore, instead of maybe thinking about the issues with Western Australian legislation, they just didn't implement quality rights training. But no state did. There were lots of reasons given. It was too expensive was another one. It's free, the course, so minimal cost. So there's this kind of every time there's some kind of attempt to implement reform, there is resistance. In the other piece that Lisa alluded to, the community guidance from the World Health Organization on all of the examples around the world of community-based, rights-based, recovery-oriented community supports, Australia was spectacularly absent from any of those examples. So we have all of the commissions, the various state commissions, the National Mental Health Commission, Productivity Commission, Royal Commissions. We've had lots of goes at reform. All of these have been framed as transformation, and that's never happened. And so, as most of you are thinking, how can this be in the face of clearly, atrocities and human rights breaches? What's going on? And even the last one, many of you are engaged with the Productivity Commission review at the moment of the agreement, again, spectacularly came out and just said it's not fit for purpose. You've messed up again. So why is it we're not investing in understanding and implementing reform?
Good question.
All right. Further context, we're just setting the scene a little bit here. So another context, and again, a bit of a spectacular failure, but the interesting commentary around the Lancet Psychiatry's Commission on Psychosis, because everyone's really quite outraged about the lack of progress and reform in this space, this very, very difficult space of psychosis. But they did make the point that in high-income countries, social outcomes for those with psychoses are poor and include high levels of unemployment, poverty, homelessness, and so on, in the decades after the initial contact with services. So this is not an access question. This is something else going on here. So we know outcomes are dreadful. We know, however, in Australia the National Mental Health Commission was brought in to drive reform, another kind of reform passing initiative. And they've been saying for quite some time that actually they're not really, in Australia, we're not measuring the extent to which our services have anything to do with rights. That seems like that's a whole other space over there. So all of our indicators, all of our data, none of it talks about rights. I've actually done word searches in these reports, and I think rights comes up maybe once or twice, and it's in the context of not being upheld. And that actually, out of the billions of dollars that we invest in the Australian mental health system, actually we don't measure whether or not there is any positive impact, outcome and experiences for individuals and their families.
Mm. And that led to our work in Western Australia. We were able to sort of voice that, weren't we?
Yes, so one of the projects we worked on was an outcomes framework, because we know now everyone's going to do outcomes, right? And so, of course, we had a look at what was being measured at the moment in Western Australia, and it had very little to do with effectiveness, citizenship, human rights, and so on. And we developed our own within the Commission.
Yeah, our own lived experience framework for
Yeah.
outcomes.
Yeah. So highlighting, of course, that every single indicator, every single tool, every single measurement at the moment is not developed by lived experience with lived experience perspectives. It is utterly dominated by the clinical gaze, effectively. And of course, this has only just come out this month, the 24 report card, just indicating yet again, as in 2023, lots of data gaps still in relation to the things that matter for people accessing our public mental health services. So the context for this conversation is about catastrophic failure of the mental health system for people with psychosis specifically. And so it's pretty clear that we don't have a shared understanding in Australia around what even constitutes reform and why we might be doing it, because clearly we're not able to implement reform at this point in time. But we all agree that it's urgent and necessary. And so for me, when I talk about reform and transformation, I am talking about an utter roots and branches reconceptualisation of distress, the needs of families, different processes for modelling what services might be needed, obviously different reporting systems. The transformation is a re-understanding of distress, and it's very much a human rights-based understanding.
Mm. And for me, I guess my time in services were difficult. It was difficult for me, but it was difficult to watch my peers be harmed by services. And I guess part of my why I wanted to come out and be on the other side and be active in trying to get reform was because no one should be harmed in any way within services when they're at their worst. To ask for help is a big thing, but to then find that help only makes things worse was just so wrong, and it still goes on today. So now, after over 20 years of speaking, being brave and speaking up, I am so frustrated that we are still here at the same place, and reform is urgent. It's needed right now.
So we looked into, particularly after the spectacular failure of the Victorian Royal Commission, where there was some hefty resources placed into it. There was a levy that was imposed on people, very, very public process of thousands of Victorians and their families talking about the harm done to them in the system. And so in leaning into the systems change literature, and there's a lot of it built up over the last, say, 50 years, particularly in the States, and all kinds of areas of social concern and disadvantage and injustice, there's really a few ways of going about it. In Australia, and particularly the Royal Commission in Victoria, you could have absolutely predicted what they've done. And part of it was simply because if we're talking about, those the normative language of transformation, they never actually quite did the transformational work. So there was never a lived experience commissioner involved in the listening and making sense of the stories. And so, of course, the recommendations were very superficial, and we've seen all of the investment go into probably more of the same. And the systems transformation literature, so you can do sort of make some structural changes, and Australia has done that beautifully. We've got a lot of mental health commissions floating around now, sort of reform passing structures that exist. But we've never sort of dived into the mental models. And if you're going to do transformational work, which is what we're talking about in the mental health system, we know that that's the mental models that we need to have conversations about and shift and unpack all of the embedded assumptions around, crudely speaking, a chemical imbalance understanding of distress, which means it's pathologised, it's individualised, it's biomedical. We know it's a failure, but we've never actually safely interrogated the medical models. And so, of course, any transformation process that will take place without reckoning with these ideologies that hold our system in place are probably doomed to failure.
And so whilst it's good we're seeing more people of lived experience, big L, big E, in these higher positions, it's actually worrying if we haven't done this transformative work and looked at the mental models that are underneath. And most important, it's dangerous.
Yeah, we were talking before about the language that's emerging now around, we call it peer washing or peer cladding, where organisations are bringing in lived experience but without the underpinning strength of a workforce that has a very clear discipline framework around it to hold a very different mental model into systems that are still captured by a biomedical model. Yeah. Okay, so leaning a bit further into the systems transformation literature and the learnings over the last, I don't know, couple of decades around what makes for successful system change. So the data in the corporate world is most change initiatives will fail. It's about a 75% failure rate. The Harvard Business Review did a study a few years ago. Change is hard. So if it's hard for organisations with all of the levers of control that they possess, system change is even more complex and difficult. Can be done. There's been a lot of analysis around what that takes, and there are 3 components that we've thought about and seen from various streams of the system transformation literature. But always, always, power has to be disrupted. You will not get change unless you are disrupting the power holders. And we've used, this is Stephen Luke's, one of the sort of preeminent system thinkers around power, the 3 faces of power. Agenda setting, decision making, narrative control, which is why we've chosen narrative control to talk about today, because that will disrupt power. But of course, unless you disrupt power, you're never going to get to an effective, accurate, honest formulation of what the problems are in the system that you're seeking to transform. And so this quote from Harvard, there's a school there that focuses very much on building state capability, talks about the mental models never being untroubled if the people that benefit from them holding power in the system are the ones that are talking about the problems. They will not see with the same clarity as people with lived experience what the problems are, and inevitably they will see the problem as being an absence of their solution. So you'd be very familiar with Four Corners episode recently where they talked about the problem being a lack of psychiatrists in the system. So this very, very dominant paradigm that controls the narrative that talks about what the problem is from a solution of a service provider is so prevalent still in Australia that we probably don't think about it very much. And underpinning all of these safely to do disrupting power, to disrupt the way that you formulate problems, you have to have a learning culture, and we've heard a lot from Jan today particularly about the skills and the capabilities that we need to build so that people can unlearn what it is they hold to be true, that they are curious instead of certain, and that they are receptive to the inevitable opposing views that we've started to talk about today, which are challenging. And if you don't have those skills and you try to do system transformation, this is the kind of dialogue that you enter into, the very unproductive back and forth between people like Danius Puris, the United Nations Special Rapporteur, who really went out hard on purpose, deliberately used his privilege to really unsettle and disrupt power. And when you do that without the underpinning or pre-work around building people's skills and capabilities to hold opposing views, to hold those feelings of being challenged in power, then you get the backlash, which is what we saw very much from the United Nations series of reports that came out. There was a discourse analysis done on that where it was very, the backlash was visceral, it was nasty, it was personal. They really went after Danius Puris, and
Yeah, it reminds me it reminds me of Professor Marius Rom, one of our founders of the Hearing Voices movement. And I remember having a conversation with him, and he shared about how when he first started to say, what if voice hearing wasn't a meaningless symptom of an illness like we were taught? And when he shared this thinking with his colleagues, they all thought he was going mad. So yeah, the backlash can be pretty full on, yeah, you have to be strong.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the journal articles, it was almost this very shrill, if I can be so gendered, backlash around the fact that it was one of our own was particularly problematic in the field. But of course, this backlash and this to and froing isn't new, and this quote comes directly from the same paper that did the discourse analysis, where this has been going on over decades, over centuries, this contest around who gets to describe the experiences of madness and who gets to prescribe the consequential allocation of resources in communities. So obviously civilizations have come and gone without mental health systems, but there's always been a contest around the nature of madness. This is just an example of if you don't do that pre-work, if you don't do that system transformation thinking and investment, what happens when you try to implement reform and you don't address the mental models. So this was just for another piece of work, a bit of an analysis on the recommendations out of the Royal Commission in Victoria that came about because of that lack of accurate power disruption, accurate problem formulation. So lots of recommendations, lots of investment, zero work done in terms of troubling the mental models that underpin our mental health systems. And so, of course, the investment in the Royal Commission, which we all acknowledge now to have failed, has gone into more of the same, into new structures where everything is different but nothing has changed, as Lisa's pointed out in terms of the CTOs after the recent legislative changes. And I guess that plays out in reverse. If you look at, this is the Australian policy cycle that all of the bureaucrats use. It's Bridgman and Davis model, it's well established, and it talks about services arrived at because of a policy cycle. So, I mean, Amanda, I think, when you talk about your services, they've come about because of someone having identified some issues, done some policy analysis around what is the problem that we're trying to seek to address here, and inevitably that cycle, theoretically, and I love how at least they've named it theoretical because we all know that policy is actually political, it's got nothing to do with evidence, but in theory we'd like to think our mental health system is evidence-based. And so inevitably, if you don't trouble those mental models at the problem identification and issues stage, you will naturally get where we end up with services through policy, through things like the National Service Planning Framework tool, which is profoundly clinical rather than rights-based, and all of that flows through to an ongoing dominance of investment in clinical models. And most of you would have seen the $1 billion or so that both parties promised at the last election, and of course none of them have gone towards anything that would reflect different ways of understanding distress. We just keep investing in more and more of the same. But I was wondering, you go, yeah.
Yeah. So I guess in plain speak, for me, once I was diagnosed, and well, it wasn't diagnosed once I was the longer I was in the system, the more diagnoses I got. Lucky me. But when that was seen as the problem, that my brain was broken, and that was the issue, I had serious mental illness, the kinds of treatment was the biomedical medication, but then the kinds of psychosocial supports were also aimed at, trying to teach me how to boil an egg. At the time, I was a mother of 7 children. But it was perceived that because I had this serious mental illness, that I needed the kind of psychosocial support that services were designed to do for people with serious mental illness. And the kind of narrative that was also fed to my family, to my children, to my husband at the time, was this very biomedical narrative that basically said, you know, the mother you once had is gone. And any wonder, I guess those services, you know, they were looking at the problem being my brain, but in actual fact, I was living in a domestic violent marriage. And that narrative gave more power to my husband at the time as well, and to my children. So it I guess that the narrative, you know, it informs the policy, which then informs the services that you get. But is that really working? Yeah, it didn't work for me, that's for sure.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and it has the effect of masking and silencing the abuse going on in the background. Yeah. Okay, so where's that evidence coming from then? I wonder about this broken brain. And we're being flip, but I should also say we do acknowledge we're all biological creatures. Clearly there is stuff going on in people's brains, and clearly this narrative works for some people. So we're not, you know, in the true tradition of lived experience, honouring all perspectives, but pointing out that the system probably does not honour all perspectives and needs to change dramatically. So again, Danius Purus called out the fact that there was a very, very biased use of evidence in tainting the knowledge of that policy cycle. It's pretty corrupt at the end of the day, and certainly not driven by experiential perspectives. Okay, so this was a good example for us of how things can go wrong in research in terms of driving the characterisation of Amanda as a walking unit of deficit rather than a beautiful human and a mother. And this is a piece that was put in the BMJ to talk about, or to research actually, the parachute use, whether or not it made any difference to people jumping out of aeroplanes and whether or not you're going to survive. Randomised controlled trial, one would think pretty reliable. However, they found, of course, it did not reduce death or major traumatic injury when jumping from an aircraft. And like so much mental health research, the devil is in the detail. And so I'm just going to flick a slide here, because actually if you dig into the methodology, of course, they were jumping from the wing of a tiny aircraft onto the ground. And so, of course, the conclusions reflected the methodology that was being used. But of course, that's been the same approach used by mental health researchers for so long. They have not included the real-world situations that people are living in, including the real-world experiential understandings of the lived experience community, who have been saying for so long, this is a trauma story, this is a violence story, these are responses to unacceptable experiences for us. Okay, and so of course, unsurprisingly, a couple of years ago an umbrella review was done looking back on all of the meta-analyses that were done that of course inform systems and policies, and found that actually there has been a very, very small effect size for the two frontline services, psychotherapy and pharmacotherapy. There's a ceiling effect that's been hit, and that we need a paradigm shift. So it is acknowledged, this was in World Psychiatry. And that, to Lisa's point around CTOs in particular, I just highlighted one of the stats that for acute treatment of, and so these are still medicalised understandings of distress, we probably wouldn't use this language, but they've called it this because that's what they are. Schizophrenia with pharmacotherapy, there are very, very different, very, very minimal differences in terms of effect size. And yet this is apparently the evidence that is underpinning our current forced treatment systems. Okay, we wanted to talk about a key concept that informs the coercive system that we have for people with psychosis in particular. And this is the concept of insight, which comes up over and over again as the rationalisation for coercive treatments. It's a lovely little case study that we've pulled out here. There's a couple of them, but it's such a key component for the way in which we think about psychosis. And I'm going to really ask you, as the expert here, to talk about some of these. But this was a little exchange between a person with lived experience. You may not know Larry Davidson, but from Yale University, a preeminent lived experience academic who wrote an op-ed in the Connecticut Main paper talking about the fact that CTOs, forced treatment, probably not evidence-based. And of course, immediately there was a backlash from a couple of people who had actually researched this concept of anosognosia as part of the DSM-3, I think. And so, of course, it was really quite disrespectful language, telling him he needed to do his research. He was obviously unaware of this phenomenon called anosognosia. And so, of course, he responded. And so this was the piece from the clinicians DSM-4, talked about the phenomena of anosognosia that we often hear about from people who don't necessarily experience what is called lack of insight. And Davidson responded, of course, by calling out that it's a very, very loose term from another experience by people. There is no actual pathology around anosognosia, and pointed out all of the reasons why lack of insight and CTOs are probably a human rights breach at the end of the day, because there is very little evidence, as Lisa so eloquently described this morning, between the way that we respond to what's seen to be lack of insight and what we should be doing instead. And so from that kind of just scene setting around unsettling something that is so embedded in our medico-legal system and most people's understandings of psychosis and having it as a justification for forced treatment, a recent piece came out in World Psychiatry. Mike Slade, one of the world's leading recovery academics, a psychologist himself, talking, of course, about this, like attacking it directly and head on, and it's really quite illuminating. And so he worked with people with a lived experience of what was called lack of insight to finally bring forward a lived experience voice around this topic. And so first person voice, talking about a lack of what was seen by the clinical gaze as being a lack of insight, not only talking about it as their understanding of what was going on, but also just pointing out that yet again, it's a re-traumatisation of someone saying, this is for your own good, and they've obviously heard that before in their experiences. And therefore blocking any kind of understanding that they may well be able to represent themselves or their own experiences. It's an extreme form of epistemic violence coming in over the top like this.
And when you experience this, it's devastating. I mean, to be told that you don't know what you clearly know. I remember trying to say that I was feeling sick with the medication, I was putting on weight, I didn't want to be on it, and being told everybody with your condition thinks they shouldn't take their medication, that I didn't have that insight to understand what was best for me, was despite what I was experiencing, I needed to still keep taking it, and that I lacked the insight to my own mental illness. Was, yeah, I mean, it's too big for words. That internal process then of doubting your own mind and doubting what you believe and what you experience. It's coercive control. It's just another part of the tactic, but at the time, that, I just felt powerless. Because the more I spoke, the more I was told that I lacked the insight.
And of course, it's often weaponised as well in terms of dangerousness and so on as well, so it can be even more harmful for people.
Yeah, it was certainly weaponised by my family against me, and to the point where I no longer have those relationships with my family, because in order to regain and reclaim my own citizenship, I needed to step out of those relationships. And yeah, as painful as that's been, that's the insight that I've learnt that I needed in order to reclaim my citizenship.
Exactly, and when you think about all of the evidence around recovery, it's about activating self-agency and growing to claim that power, and it just seems like a counterintuitive thing at the end of the day. Okay, so what happens then? This is building on the work that Lisa spoke of this morning. This is a new study coming out from the States, where if you're deemed to lack insight, then of course you're going to be forced into hospitalisation. And the lack of evidence, I guess, around this is highlighted in this study where there was it was a judgment call. So do we hospitalise someone, do we not? But we know from this particular study, it was done this year in Pittsburgh, that the evidence shows that when it's a judgment call like this, there is destabilisation. People are more likely to lose money, they're more likely to lose their job, they're more likely to seek shelter outside of their own home, and that actually being involuntarily committed, as it's called, or having outpatient CTOs is extraordinarily harmful for people. But interestingly, the data at the top there talks about, again, just highlights the lack of evidence where the spread of hospitalisation or not hospitalisation was very much up to the inclinations of the physician. So one physician never hospitalised someone, 46 physicians just hospitalise people 100% of the time. And so there's very, very little evidence or tools or measurements or conversations to unpick this issue of insight. So we just wanted to finish with the fish pamphlet, which is something from the early 70s coming out of Scotland, and eventually this is an English one, which really describes the lived experience perspective of power imbalances, even back then before there was the UNCRPD and so on. Did you want to talk about what it represents?
Yeah, okay, so here we have the picture of a fish. And the fish, I guess, represents those of us with lived experience. And sometimes when a fish is being caught and it's wriggling around, and it could look like psychosis, really. But what we focus on is all that moving around and wriggling. We don't see why. There's a hook in its mouth. And if we were to take that hook out, it might stop and throw it back in the water. It might start wriggling back into its normal path. So I guess pictures are powerful. Pictures, this is a symbol that was used way back by people of lived experience. And sadly, still today, it's still just as relevant.
Yeah, so this was early 70s, I think, and really that picture probably talks about power imbalance or chemical imbalance at the end of the day.
Pretty much, yeah.
And I think the other picture was a bit later than that. I think that's Judy Chamberlain's era,
Judy
maybe?
Chamberlain,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, so again, even back then, people with lived experience claiming knowledge that housing might be more helpful than Haldol, I think they called it. Haloperidol.
Haloperidol, yeah.
So these conversations have been had in the grey literature, in lounge rooms with people with lived experience for decades and decades and decades. The interesting issue for us, of course, is, so this has been around for a very long time. Brian Burdekin highlighted it, United Nations has highlighted it. So what will it take for this knowledge to be privileged over the existing knowledge Are you going to say something? Or
Yeah, I'm curious to hear from everybody.
So we're gonna lean into some questions and some things. So asking people, well, you know, how do you conceptualize distress? What do you think are the causes? How do you describe it? What's your explanation for it? Those unpacking causative models, all of the conceptualizations you have. What's your mental model? Because that will then translate into what it is that we think we need to do in terms of addressing this dreadful thing called madness.
Addressing the problem. What is really the problem?
Exactly. And how has it been created? So we know that there are things like anchoring bias and confirmation bias, and what you learn first is usually what you stick with. So how is it that your mental model was created? And who controls that narrative and those mental models in your areas of work? What's your understanding of the relative legitimacy of either of these models? And then, of course, this leans back to the last point, is the conversation we had last night at the town hall, where we went through a Twitter thread from US lived experience academic Nev Jones, who talked about their experience of sitting as a lived experience researcher, sitting in meetings where people very confidently talked about schizophrenia spectrum, treatment resistant, all kinds of clinical conceptualizations as though it was the truth. And sitting there as someone with a lived experience of it going inside, no, this is not how it is. And so very much they were asking the question, how is it or when is it, and when will we have these conversations that really get to the bottom of the reason why our system is so stuck in terms of transformation? And then maybe, just maybe, was the language that they used, that maybe if we have these conversations, we may be able to push forward with transformation. So thank you.